Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox back with another episode, and you're in for a treat today because I'm in for a treat today. Number one, we have our first Red Raider on the podcast. So, as much as it pains me to say it, go Raiders. But we have John Brock, who's the author of The Great Ice Cream War of Summer 2016. He's also the marketing manager for Texas Tech University. So, John, first of all, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. Yeah, I appreciate you having me on, and I listen to the podcast on a regular basis. I really enjoy it.
So, tell us about your day job, John.
My day job is a marketing manager of Texas Tech University Press, and we're the book publishing arm of the university, but you would think it would just be scholarly academic books by professors, but we do everything from poetry to memoirs to short story collections. We do a little bit of everything. And I think a lot of people, when they hear university press, think it has to be an academic scholarly type book to even be considered to be published. But I would just kind of encourage anybody that's thinking of publishing, if your book kind of fits in with the university press, with the type of books that they do, always feel free to reach out to university presses as a potential publisher of your book.
So let's start out with your book, The Great Ice Cream War of Summer 2016. What's the origin and inspiration for this story?
I actually started it back in 2016. It was more of a kind of a short story idea, and I would just kind of work on it just when I had a chance. It wasn't like my serious project. It was just, I was going to a restaurant, and it was in a big shopping center. And as we got out of the car, I noticed there was a food truck just about 50 yards away from the restaurant. And in my mind, I was like, I would be really upset if I had this restaurant and a food truck had decided to park 50 yards away from my business. And this was 2016 up in Lubbock. Food trucks weren't all that common. You would see them at events and stuff like that, but just kind of out in the open, you would never really see a food truck. And so that was kind of the initial inspiration of the story. And when it started, I kind of had the idea that it would be more of a comical novel. But as I got more into it, it kind of grew a little bit more serious. I think I was trying to think of it as comedic and external terms where there'd be funny events and stuff like that. But it really kind of turned into an internal story, how the war wasn't really between the ice cream shop owner and the gelato food truck owner. It was more of just kind of an internal thing about how things change and yet how you really can't battle time. That's kind of an unwinnable war. So that was kind of how the story progressed and started.
I love talking to writers about your writing process. I've written a lot of books. They're all in nonfiction around legal and regulatory compliance, business ethics, leadership, things like that. I've tried to write fiction. I've written close to finishing a couple, but never done what you did, which is get one published. But in my fiction writing, unlike my nonfiction, which is very structured, it's almost stream of consciousness. I see it in my head or it plays out in my head, and I almost feel like I'm recording it as it goes on. And characters do things I'm not expecting. They say things that's not expected. It goes in different directions. You mentioned how perhaps the story either grew or took on a dimension you hadn't anticipated. So I really wanted to visit with you about your process. Is it structured? Is it unstructured? Is it all of the above? Is it some of the above? Is it none of the above?
It's kind of some of the above, and it kind of depends on the project. Like a book like this, it's a little novella. It's about 90 pages, so it's not that big of a story. And you would think, why would it take someone 8 years to write this story? But it kind of just started out as a side project, and I would just work on it a little bit at a time. And then I would kind of get stuck on what I want, where the story should go. In this particular case, there wasn't really like an outline, or I didn't even really know how the story was going to end. And then the pandemic hit, and this was about 4 years after I started the story. And I did not feel like writing. I know a lot of people took advantage of working from home or maybe not being at work, that they could just sit at home and take time to write. But it kind of had the opposite effect on me. I just kind of really felt like my creative juices were just gone. I just didn't feel, I just kind of would sit in front of the TV and stream movies and TV shows. I think I call it the Tiger King syndrome, where everybody just kind of locked in and watched that show at the beginning of the pandemic. And then it kind of picked up after that. And kind of an interesting thing is you never, or at least in my case, I'll write something and then somebody will read it and they'll go, "Oh, this is about you." And I'm like, "No, this isn't about me." I'm not an ice cream shop owner. But the more I thought about it, my grandfather owned like a little neighborhood grocery store. And I was really young when he kind of stopped being a grocer and sold the business and everything. But I dedicated this story to my mom and dad, and I didn't really let them read it beforehand before it was published. And when I gave it to him, my dad just kind of said, "This is your grandfather's story," because the big chain supermarkets came in and just kind of wiped them out of business. And as a kid, you don't know the background of what's happening in your grandparents' lives or your parents' lives. And I just thought that was just something that was always there. And I didn't know that's the story I was telling. But in looking back at it, was, of course, that was the story I was telling.
You're the first author I've interviewed who has written a novella. Can you explain to our audience what a novella is, how it fits between a short story and a novel, and why this form or format really lent itself to the story you wanted to tell, and maybe also the difference between it and a novel, how an author or a writer can use that to their advantage?
Yeah, I think a novella is really good for just telling stories that don't have the weight of taking on 280 pages or a full length novel story, because you can still tell a story in a novella. You can kind of have the three-act structure. A short story typically is not a three-act structure. It's more of just kind of a here's what happened and maybe a little coda at the end. So a novella is usually around 20,000 to 50,000 words. And my story is about 20,000 words, so that's about 90 pages. A short story is usually around 10,000 words or 30 pages. And a novel can be 70,000 words plus. It could 120,000 words. It just kind of depends on the story that you want to tell. So I think a novella is like the perfect little format to write stories that just don't have the significance to be. This was a novel, people would probably put it down after after 90 pages because it just wasn't the story I needed to tell. It was a smaller story that just needed to be told in a smaller chunk.
I'm also fascinated with your thoughts that this story's really about change. And if I can tie that into what may seem as disparate points, but 2025 and your grandfather's store, and how economic change and the revolution of supermarkets, and whenever he gave up his store, certainly changed the dynamics of his business. 2025 to me seems not that the pace of change seems to me to have sped up. I don't think we'll ever have as change as big as we went through during the pandemic, but every day it's potentially something new. And certainly politically, in business with OpenAI, and in your world and the university world is equally as dynamic. But is that story of change, is that really a universal story that we can use to tell as a framework to tell a lot of different stories?
I think so. Yeah, I really do think so. If I hadn't have started the story back in 2016, it probably would have been updated to 2025, and because I finished it in 2024. But I thought 2016 was such a, not that I knew it when I started writing the story, but it was such a significant year. That was really when you could start feeling the divide between people, and technology was just kind of speeding up. Now, 2016 seems kind of quaint now that we have artificial intelligence and just everything going on in the world. It just seems overwhelming at times. And you think 9 years ago that there wouldn't be that big of a difference. I think change is a good subject to kind of tackle in your writing. Just kind of how it's subtle, but how traumatic and powerful it can be.
Also, it strikes me that with the format you have chosen, the novella format, you can take something that I think you may have called quieter, but I'm going to say subtler, and use that as a story that perhaps you could not sustain an entire novel. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. Not to say that this is a political story or anything like that, but it's really there as a kind of a subtle metaphor, because I talk about during the summer of when these events take place, it's this heat wave. And I don't really call it climate change. I just say, oh, this is awfully odd that it's so hot during the summer and it's like nothing they've ever seen before. And then at the coda at the end of the story, it's in November, right before the presidential election or right after the presidential election. And there's a huge snowstorm that comes through. And it's there very quiet, it's very subtle, but I think you could really pick up, and that's one of the things I think a writer could really use as a tool in a novella, is just kind of make these subtle little things that they want to comment on, but it's not like you're beating somebody over the head with a hammer saying, here's my point. It's more of, I think people can, or readers can relate to that a lot more in kind of a quieter, subtle story.
To even bring it forward to 2025, I live near Kerrville, and we have one small sporting goods store in Kerrville. And the city council has just approved a huge $500,000 tax break for a major sporting goods company to open a store in Kerrville. And the public debate is not so much whether that sporting good company could or should come, because everyone agrees they can and they should. But the debate is, should the city council be picking winners basically by giving someone that huge tax rebate and not giving that same kind of relief to a local business owner who's going to be frankly wiped out by this? And so that debate is ongoing, certainly in small town Texas every day, I think.
Yeah, I can see that. Lubbock is a relatively bigger town. It's about 300,000 metro area populations. But I can still see the local businesses really struggling to survive when a bigger business comes in. And it's not that I have an answer for it, that I'm like leaning one way or the other. When a big business comes in, that means more jobs for more people. And I can see that aspect of it. But I just really feel for local businesses that have to suffer and maybe potentially have to shut down just because they can't compete. It's an unfair competition in a way. So I can see both sides of the debate, and I wish I had an answer. I don't know what the answer is. If I did, maybe I wouldn't have to write a book about it or a novella.
Well, and I wrote an op-ed piece which was entitled "I Have Questions and More Questions," and even after writing it and submitting it, all I had was questions. I didn't have any answers, so I'm completely with you. Let me turn to what we've called tenacity in writing, and I'll start with my then 7-year-old daughter, now 27. When she was 7, she wrote her first book, and I said, "Honey, how did you do this?" Because at that point in my life, I hadn't written any books. And she said, "Dad, it's easy to write a book. You just sit down and do it." I'm like, "Oh, that's it." But you've already told us you were 8 years, your novella was 8 years in the making. So I'd like to really explore with you about the tenacity to keep going and how obviously things happen to your personal life. We had the pandemic we both talked about, but why is it so important to keep at it, stay motivated, and just crank it out even when you may not feel like doing it?
Yeah, I think most writers, I don't know where I got this. For me, it's kind of a compulsion. If I don't write every day, and it doesn't have to be like, in my instance, I don't feel like I have to write 3 pages a day. There's not like a set amount that I have to work every day. Sometimes it might just be a paragraph. But as long as I'm working, I just kind of have this kind of a compulsion to write. And I think a lot of people maybe don't really kind of have that compulsion or haven't developed it yet. So I would just encourage people, when you're beginning a project, don't think about publishing, don't think about marketing, just kind of focus on the story, and don't worry about, oh, this isn't a genre piece and how am I going to sell this. If you get an idea for a story, I always kind of, that spark I think is really important. It's a story that that is saying, please tell my story, please write my story. And so I think a lot of people, a lot of writers get kind of hung up on the mechanics of it as three act structure. I have to hit this point piece, and it's kind of a formula for them. But I think if you really want to be a writer, you really just kind of have to stay at it And don't worry about a word count. Just kind of write every day. And some days you might just write a sentence. Other days you might write 3 to 4 pages, but you just got to keep going. And for me, it just feels like something I have to do. If I miss a day of writing, however minor it might be, I just kind of feel like, oh, that was kind of a wasted day. And being with this novella, I hadn't really published before, and I'm in my 50s. So it was kind of, when I started writing, it was more like, I'm never going to be published. Why am I even doing this in my 20s and 30s? To find a publisher just seemed like it was this unattainable goal. And then self publishing came out, and people, I just kind of like how if you want to be a writer, I wouldn't think about trying to be, I wouldn't think of it as a professional career. I would just think of it as more of a, this is just something I need to do. And if I can get a book published, that's great. If I have to self-publish, that's great. And even the act of writing itself, even if you don't publish it, is just very rewarding in itself. So I kind of look at it at all angles.
I'm a morning person. If I don't have it done by noon, it ain't getting done.
Yeah.
And I'm great until noon, but the minute I take a break, it's like everything goes. Like all creative juices, all focus, all attention. So I'm great at writing in the morning. Do you have a particular time of day? Are you able to write when the spirit or muse moves you? What's that part of your writing style like?
I'm like you. If I don't start in the morning, I don't sit at my computer and write for an hour. It's more of like, I make a cup of coffee and I just kind of think about what I'm going to be writing for the day or trying to figure out the story. And then I'll just kind of write maybe a couple of paragraphs in the morning. Usually I have something else going on or I have to be at work by 8. And I'm not an early morning person by nature. If I get up by 6:30, have breakfast, get ready for work, write a couple of paragraphs, that kind of gets my mind to, during the workday, think about what I'm going to write when I get home. And then when I get home, I usually around 6 or 7, I'll write for an hour. And maybe that'll be like 2 pages, 3 pages, maybe on a good day. And that's pretty much it for me. Excuse me. My writing habits, I guess, could be a little bit more controlled, where I'm doing it the same every day, but it's usually just kind of writing a couple of paragraphs in the morning, kind of getting the mind started on the story, and then finishing up that evening.
You mentioned the self-publishing process. Could you give us a few lessons you've learned on that? And then the after you get it published part comes the thing we all distaste the most, which is marketing. So
Yeah.
other than the coolness of being on my podcast, could you tell us about the marketing part of your book?
Yeah, self-publishing, I think, is kind of a tricky thing for new writers because they don't realize, how to get a book in Barnes and Noble. You need an ISBN or other bookstores. You have to have an ISBN, and bookstores and independent bookstores don't order from Amazon. So if you have your book on Amazon exclusively, there's no way that bookstores can order it. And you could order some, you could have some printed from Amazon, shipped to you, and then you sell directly to the bookstores. But the best way of doing that is getting an ISBN, getting the copyright. So I would just kind of learn, if you wanted to self-publish, all the technical aspects that you'll need and kind of fit that into your budget, because ISBNs can be pretty expensive depending on how many you wanted to buy at once. And as far as marketing goes, for a self-publishing book, it's really tough. It's a really tough road because at a university press, we work with a sales consortium that meets with, we don't have the budget for me to go up to New York City and visit with the Barnes and Noble people and the Amazon people. It's more of we have sales reps that do that for us. And so I present our books to the sales reps, and the sales reps visit with the big vendors. And up in New York, the Barnes and Noble people, they're the ones that buy books for the entire country. You could go into your local Barnes and Noble and say, hey, I'm a local author. Here's my book. And sometimes they'll include it in their store. But if you wanted kind of like national marketing exposure, it's a really tough way to go. And even though that this book is self-published, I don't have anything against traditional publishing. It has so many advantages. Just you're working with a editing crew that'll make sure that your book is copywritten and just kind of catch all of the grammatical errors that you might have made. And then you kind of have the marketing budget behind you, and you have the support of a marketing person like that's going to a book conference. They can take the book with them to the conference to sell. Just thinking about travel expenses for an author to go to an event that's cross country for 3 days and to sell their book. It's, for most people, it's just not economically feasible. Marketing for self-publishing is a tricky business, but it can be done. It's just you just gotta try to find innovative ways. Social media and all that is a great help for self-published books.
Could you say a few words about the Texas University Press and how you guys are adapting, and maybe even a little preview of what you got coming up in the summer or fall?
Yeah, I think as the university press as a whole I think is doing really well, just in general across the country. It seems like people are kind of returning to buying books. And a few years ago, people would be talking about, oh, there's not going to be any bookstores because everything's going to be digital. And that didn't happen. People still buy ebooks. I buy ebooks, but the print book is still a really important thing. And university presses kind of want to just kind of let people know that it's not all scholarly and academic. You kind of, every press kind of has its own regional focus and subjects that they're really attuned to. So I would just kind of encourage readers to just go out and kind of research university presses and just kind of find some books that they're interested in. And if you're interested in books, like we have a Vietnam Center here at the university, so we do a lot of Vietnam War related books. And a lot of people from around the world kind of know us as the authority on Vietnam War books and history, just because we have that relationship with our Vietnam Center here on campus. So every university press has kind of like their little focus a little area that they focus on. Some of the books that we have coming out, one that I thought readers would really like, and writers, is one called Small Town Author. And this is by John Erickson. He's the author of the Hank the Cowdog series. And this is his memoir of becoming a writer. And it's kind of, he moved to New York City and kind of went that, he thought that was the route he needed to go to become a writer, is to go to the big city and get that experience. But it wasn't, he just kind of realized that wasn't the type of author that he was. So he came back to his hometown up in the Panhandle and really started the Hank the Cowdog series. So that's a really good book that just recently came out. And then later on in the fall, we have a book called Daughter of a Song. And this is a memoir by Sarah Curtis. And she's the daughter of Sonny Curtis, the rock and roll of the Crickets, Buddy Holly and the Crickets. And he even wrote the theme song to the Mary Tyler Moore Show. So he's had a really interesting history from rock and roll to Hollywood to kind of the Texas musical scene. We're really excited about that book.
John, unfortunately, we are near the end of our time for this episode. But before we leave, I wanted to ask you, if our listeners wanted to connect with you, find out more about your writing, certainly find out more about your book and how to get it, what would be the best place or places for them to go?
Yeah, the best place to go to get my books are anywhere online, your preferred vendor. They're on Amazon and Barnes and Noble. I'll have a sell of the book on Ingram. You can go to Ingram Spark, and the discount code will be Hill Country Authors, and the book will be $2 off. It's a $9.95 regular price, so you can get it there at $7.95. And then on social media, I'm on Facebook and Instagram. Instagram is where I mainly kind of focus on my kind of author social medias. You can find me there at J.A. Brock Writes.
John, this has been a great visit. Congratulations on getting the book published and your perseverance. And I hope we can continue this conversation.
Sure. Thank you for having me.